During our break in the fall of 1976, we went back into the studio to record Rock and Roll Over, which was released in November. It was our sixth album in less than 3 years' time. Our initial productivity as a band was all about keeping our heads above water. But just because we'd reached a certain level of financial security, I didn't see any reason not to remain productive. It was fun to go into the studio. I'd spent my whole life dreaming of being in the studio. The studio was also a place where I could hide out when we were off the road. I still had virtually no social life, very few friends, and the studio was a safe haven, and one where we now had carte blanche. I could go there and not have to keep my eye on the clock. Those bills would be paid without so much as a raised eyebrow. When Destroyer had come out earlier that year, the album had thrown some people because it didn't sound like us live. But it did capture the essence of what we did, by creating a cinematic feel that represented the magnitude of our shows, even if it didn't recreate the sound of our shows. Bob Ezrin had enhanced and broadened our sound. He had magnified the four characters. But when we asked people around us what they thought of it, they sometimes said things like, "It's different." Different is not a good word in that context. It's a word people use when they can't make up their minds whether they like something or not. The truth is, the change scared us too. Maybe we didn't want to have a nanny this time around either, someone telling us how to do everything and blowing a whistle in our faces. We figured we'd done our apprenticeship, and Peter and Ace certainly had no desire to work with Bob again. We decided to try a more meat-and-potatoes approach, go back to basics. The first thing we did was contact Jack Douglas, who had produced Aerosmith's 3 most recent albums, Get Your Wings, Toys in the Attic, and Rocks. The problem was that Jack was friends with Bob, and he turned around and told Bob we had asked him. It wasn't tactful on Bill's part not to tell Bob first. The whole thing blew up, and we felt like we'd been caught hitting on a friend's girlfriend. Then came the idea of going back to Eddie Kramer because Alive had been so good. We rented the Star Theater in Nanuet, New York, outside the city, but close enough that we could all go home at night. Eddie came on board, and we retreated to familiar territory as fast as we could. Even though Eddie was from South Africa, he had the air of an English gentleman. He was part of the heritage we all loved. One thing we hoped Eddie could fix was our drum sound. After all, he'd been part of getting that big drum sound Zeppelin had. He had Peter set up in the theater itself while we played in a studio elsewhere in the building. We linked Peter in by video camera. In theory, even a chimpanzee beating on pots and pans could sound thunderous in the right environment. But still, the drum sounded tinny. Soon, however, I came to the conclusion that in Zeppelin's case, John Bonham was that sound, and Peter Criss would never be John Bonham. Eddie didn't function as a musical director or visionary in terms of arrangements the way Bob had, and we missed that leadership. No one was there to help us write or shape songs. I was having trouble coming up with songs, so I asked Sean Delaney to come over to my apartment for writing sessions. Those informal get-togethers at my 52nd Street place yielded Makin' Love, Mr. Speed, and Take Me for Rock and Roll Over, as well as All American Man, which showed up on Alive 2 the following year. Hard Luck Woman was an anomaly because I never intended it for Kiss. I didn't see songwriting as an exercise, and normally I was good at self-editing. If I didn't think a song had a place on a Kiss album, I didn't bother to finish it. But I was still fascinated by trying to figure out what made certain songs by other people tick. I'd been listening to Rod Stewart's Maggie May and You Wear It Well with that in mind and decided to try my hand at something similar. The lyrical spark came from someplace completely different, a song called Brandy by Looking Glass that was about a sailor's daughter who worked at a bar. Once I finished the song, I couldn't imagine Kiss doing it. I planned to try to get it to Rod to see whether he wanted to record it. But with Beth doing so well that fall, Eddie Kramer and Gene both thought the song would make a logical follow-up for Kiss. And since Peter had that type of raspy voice like Rod's, we figured he should sing it. I had to record a vocal for Peter to follow, and again, he took many takes to provide enough material to cobble together a finished version. The situation within the band had deteriorated, even in the space of 6 months since we made Destroyer. Peter brought in a cassette with a disjointed sketch of a song called Baby Driver. He always brought tapes with recordings he'd done with co-writers because he couldn't play us a song any other way since he didn't play any instruments. Peter lashed out when we worked on his songs. But the problem wasn't that Gene and I rewrote his songs. The problem was that the things Peter brought in weren't songs to begin with. The lyrics never rhymed. There weren't any delineations between verse and chorus. They were scraps, not songs. Yes, the band was stronger when everyone participated, but somebody had to lay down the law when something simply wasn't good enough. Bob performed that role on Destroyer, created Beth for Peter, and guided us all creatively. Now that it fell to us, it was futile to try to hold Peter to the same standard we insisted on for the rest of the material. There was leeway because, hey, we wanted a Peter song. That was part of the image of Kiss, and now because of Beth, Peter expected to write the songs he sang instead of singing mine, Gene's, or Ace's. But even with the additional wiggle room as far as quality, we couldn't let his stuff undermine the integrity of a record. Of course, for Peter's co-writer, getting a song credit on a Kiss album was a gravy train, so Peter always pushed his buddies' ideas and made a stink if anyone suggested they weren't quite up to scrub. Peter spent all his emotional energy worrying about his place in the hierarchy without the ability to be honest with himself about the quality of what he brought to the table. Ace was a shadow of his former self. He had been a bright light that looked as if it could explode. He had the talent to be as good as he thought he was. The potential was there for him to have been one of the all-time greats, but the booze and Valium and Coke and whatever else now left him incapacitated almost all the time. We prayed we'd be able to get a solo out of him before he passed out. He wasn't funny anymore, in any way. When he tried to tell jokes, he had to stop and slur, "How's it go again?" The situation sometimes made me angry. I had busted my ass for the band, and I felt that these two guys were playing fast and loose with my future based on their irrational whims and inner conflicts. And yet, because the deterioration took place in stages, I found I accepted things I never would have initially. If you try to bend a tree down to the ground, it breaks. If you bend it incrementally, little by little, you can get it parallel to the ground without snapping it. It just took time. That was me. There was very little band mentality anymore. The other three guys drifted off to their own social circles, and we all had our own people telling each of us how great we were. Between their sycophantic friends and all the press, Peter and Ace began to believe they were world-class virtuosos despite mounting evidence to the contrary. When we argued with Peter over his songs, he'd say things like, "You just don't want me to do this because I wrote the biggest song," or "You don't want me to do this because I'm the best singer." And he constantly accused me of not having paid my dues, apparently because I hadn't spent a decade before Kiss playing in bands that went nowhere like he had. Both Peter and Ace were fucked up all the time. I'd seen plenty of functional addicts. Bob Ezrin had been doing a lot of coke and chugging Remy Martin while we recorded Destroyer, but the quality of his work never flagged. Bill O'Coin, Neil Bogart, and much of the Casablanca staff were on a slippery slope doing lots of drugs, too. Drugs and alcohol were like a Ferrari. There's a split-second difference between being in control and being wrapped around a telephone pole. You're in control, and then you pass that line and don't realize it until it's too late. I hoped Bill would be able to save Peter and Ace, but that turned out to be foolish. Bill couldn't even save himself. If Gene and I tried to diffuse unpleasant situations by saying, "Come on, man, that's the drugs talking," Peter and Ace would respond by insisting they knew exactly what they were saying. Peter's insecurities got more and more crippling with the addition of drugs. The whole world was against him. One day in the studio, he exploded about something and smashed my acoustic 12-string guitar against the wall. There was a moment of deafening silence after that. During another argument, Gene snapped at Peter, "Peter, you're an illiterate idiot who can't read or even talk correctly and never finished school." "Yeah," said Peter, "and I'm in the same band as you." To this day, that remains the smartest thing I ever heard Peter say.